Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. This is Scott Anthony, Senior Partner at Insight and the lead author of Eat, Sleep, Innovate. I am joined by Ed Catmull, the co-founder of Pixar, among a number of other things. We're going to just wait about a minute as people gather before we get into today's conversation. I guess while we're just waiting, Ed, you were telling me about the fancy setup that you have that allows you to look directly at the camera. I think you used the phrase goosenet. What exactly is the computer setup that you have?
Well, it's jury rigged, and people have made it easy to do this, but the idea is to have a flexible, in this case, a cable that comes down that holds a small camera. And so the camera basically is there. So I've just placed it close to where you are so that when I look at you, it actually looks like I'm looking at the camera. And you can only do that, of course, if they're in proximity. And then when I'm not on a video call, I just move the camera out of the way. And it took a while to find the right cameras because most of them are too big or they're too wide, and the goosenecks are a pain in the neck to install and put in place because nobody makes them for this purpose.
It sounds like there's an innovation opportunity, a job that is just waiting to get done. And I guess once a tinkerer, always a tinkerer, right?
I know, it's just like, I was going to get it right. Fooling around with lights and.
All right, very good. Well, let's. Yeah, it's great. It does feel like you're looking at me, which is good. I'm impressed. I'll have to try it out myself. But anyway, I want to get into the conversation because I've got a bunch of questions. I am sure the people who are joining us are going to have a bunch of questions as well. So for those of you who have not joined one of these discussions, this is the third discussion we've had as part of the virtual book club related to Eat, Sleep, Innovate. I've got a bunch of questions that I have created to ask Ed, and Ed needs no introduction, but for those of you who somehow don't know him, he is the co-founder of Pixar, among a number of other things. I believe, Ed, if the internet's not lying to me, you've got 5 Academy Awards and have done a bunch of other things and won a bunch of other awards through a very illustrious career. I just hear from the people in the audience, would love people just to type into the chat window just to make sure you're out there, your favorite Pixar movie. So type that into the chat window, send it to all panelists. I'll call a couple of them out. I would love to get questions from the audience as we go through the discussion. Feel free to type it into the Q&A window. I've got an Inside Out that has already appeared in the chat window, and some other things are coming in. Ratatouille, which is one of my favorites. My favorite is Wall-E, personal favorite. Do you have a favorite, Ed? That's a not fair question. They're like asking about my 4 children, which one I like the most. But is there a movie that's a kind of soft spot in your heart?
Well, the first thing to note is your comment is like asking who your favorite child is that one thing you couldn't do as a parent is to actually say. All right, so the cheap answer is that I like my children, I can't say. The more complicated answer, though, is that the movies don't mean the same thing to me because everyone has a history, there's drama, there's growth, there's conflict in the making of the movie. And that's what I remember. So I just look at the movies in different ways in terms of their impact on the company, on the people. And it's one of the reasons why I can't actually say it in the same way. So that means I have to go back to the cheap answer, which is that they're like my children and I can't say.
Well, my 4-year-old has been very happy with the invention of Disney Plus. I live out here in Singapore and we own many of the Pixar movies, but now having access to the entire catalog, he has discovered the Toy Story series and he saw his father blubber like a baby while watching Toy Story 3, which just gets me every time that I see it.
Yeah, that was an excellent movie.
But again, they're all.
And there's a long history behind that one too.
I'm sure we could spend all of the time hearing some of the histories behind it. Of course, those of you who have not read Creativity Incorporated, absolute must read. You hear some of the backstories about the movies, you hear some of the things that make Pixar unique, and we'll talk about some of those things tonight. But what I wanted to do is I really wanted to start actually at the end. So you were kind enough to write an endorsement for our book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And you said, if you want to unleash more creativity in your organization, you can't simply tell people what you want. You need a culture that emboldens them to behave like innovators. And you need to trust that that is what they want to do. And it was that phrase, that you need to trust that that is what they want to do, that really struck me. Can you say a little bit more about what that phrase means to you?
Well, I think in a lot of industries now, and certainly in ours, is that a significant number of people come in who want to make a difference in the world. They are, they have, I think most of us have this altruistic part of us that wants to do good in the world. So when people come in and work in a company, they like to think that they're contributing, and that could be services. It's not like saying, well, high tech or the entertainment industry is the place to make the difference. There are all sorts of places to make a difference, both in terms of the product of the company or their relationships with people. But there's that feeling of contributing to the world, and that's a powerful force. And a countervailing force, not the only one, is that sometimes managers like to or believe that managing means they have to be in charge, they have to know everything that's going on. And so there's a dynamic that happens inside of companies where people with new ideas or new ways of thinking about things hold back, or they're too conservative, or the messages are given either explicitly or implicitly about how to behave, with these unspoken assumptions, and often the unspoken assumptions are incorrect. So you got this sort of mess of humanity working together, and through all of that, if you actually believe that most of the people want to do the right thing, then you kind of step back and say, okay, I trust that they want to do the right thing. If people intend to do the right thing, and then they do something and it doesn't work, then our response has got to be, I trust your intent. It may not have worked, but actually, I'm glad you tried something. And it's that intent and that trust in the intent, which I think is the basis for a creative company.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it connects into one of the things that is in the book. So, one of the case studies we describe in the book is DBS Bank, a big bank that's based here in Singapore. And they were early in their cultural transformation. They were visiting companies in Silicon Valley to learn about their cultures, and they went to visit Netflix. And they were kind of grousing a little bit to Netflix. They said, well, yeah, Netflix, this all sounds great, no rules and all that, but you actually have it easy, because you can just hire these young engineers out of Silicon Valley, and we just have a different talent stock. And the person from Netflix said, well, let me ask you a question. How old is your average engineer? And the DBS person said they're in their 40s. And Netflix said, same age as ours. And the Netflix person then said, in fact, many of the engineers that we hire from banks like yours. We just get out of their way. And I think it goes into the idea you have that if you have faith, if you have trust, and you get the right people and you get out of their way, really good, really creative things can happen. But that doesn't mean that they don't need help. So the next thing I wanted to ask you is, there was an email that's quoted in the book where you talk about the wrap party for Frozen 2. And you said it's your 32nd wrap party in your time at Pixar and Disney. And you said, one thing I can count on is that every director, including the very best, loses objectivity in their film. They don't particularly want an outside voice hitting them with a 2x4, but without it, they would not succeed. And while the directors initially don't want the outside voice, they've learned to value it. Say a little bit more about what's going on there. This kind of gets into the Braintrust thing that's such an important component of the creative process at Pixar, doesn't it?
Well, you've got a group of people who are leading a project, and what makes a project is you're doing something which is new. You're not just repeating what you've done before. So you're trying to be creative and be original. So you're solving problems. So this group of people, in our case, led by one or two directors, but there's several other people involved in the story and the artistic look of the film. And they're putting this complex thing together, but a lot of it's in their heads. So they've solved problems and they've come up with solutions in this complex interwoven thing in their head. And if you come and you point out flaws in it, you basically pull some loose strings because it isn't really quite working. If you're working, you're about done. That's the key thing to understand is, and until you're done, you got loose strings. Sometimes even when you're done, you have loose strings. You pull it apart and this whole thing can collapse. And people are working to hold these complex things in their head. So if you are pointing out a problem, the person who's pointing out the problem doesn't have this whole big complex thing in their head. They only have what they just saw in the screening or in the presentation that they were given. So they have a different viewpoint. And sometimes they say things which can cause it to collapse and cause the whole thing to restart. So frequently people might come in a defensive posture. And it's painful when they find out that others don't like it. But the reality is that in the end, that those comments and those discussions lead to better solutions and better outcomes. So most of the directors are quite comfortable with the fact that they have to go through the pain. But there are some who actually can't make the changes. We've had some directors who can't take it all the way through because they can't get the thing that's in their head out of their head. So you're in this complex position where you want the vision of the leaders and the faith, which means they have to push on something that others don't believe in. But then there are times when it doesn't work and they have to let go. That's a hard place to be in. How do you hold on to your vision at the same time know when to let go because some people say that vision isn't working? And so you can't say, oh, here are the rules or here are the step-by-step processes to go through. Is you have to engage in the mess. That's what it is. You're in the mess in the middle.
And are there any just general kind of heuristics for how you get through the mess in the middle? Because I could totally imagine what this is like. And we see this when we're working on new innovative ideas all the time. In the beginning, everyone is thrilled, everything looks great. You go and do some stuff, you learn that some of the things that you were assuming were right, some were wrong, and there's the moment. But what do you do now? Do you go and plow forward even though some things aren't working? Do you go and course correct in some way? Do you stop? And how do you go and manage through it? What gets you through the messy middle? Because that's a reality of any creative journey.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the way I look at it, is that when you're doing something new, original, that you look at the big picture, like is the thing that I'm trying to build or make a good thing to do, a good project, a worthy project. And you may not know exactly what it is. It's sort of like having a goal, but that long-term goal is not very well defined, but you know that's true. So to get there, you have to go through some tactical steps. You have to try things and see if they work. Those steps are not your goal. They're the steps towards a goal. And if you look at them as tactical, then you don't think of something that doesn't work as even a failure. This is like, we tried this and it doesn't work. So we try something else, but we learned something from it. So there's a mindset that comes in to say, I'm going to keep changing the steps to get there. In the process, I'm altering what I think is going to work or not work, but I'm also altering what that long-term goal is. I'm actually getting clarity on it. So you've got a dynamic between the long-term and the short-term. So now let's come to the short-term. We have regular meetings, so it's like every 3 to 4 months, what project gets pitched. In this case, if it's a film, then we're actually showing a mock-up of the film so everybody can see it. Actually, it's an advantage in filmmaking is because everybody can sort of see a rough cut version of what it's moving towards. Makes it easy to have easier discussions. But in other projects, it's presentations or slides or whatever it is to get everybody up to speed to the conversation. Now, at this point, the people presenting where they are know that they don't have the final solutions yet. They're only part of the way in the process. So by definition, they don't have a successful project. This is just where they are right now. But a lot of people are fairly vulnerable at this point of view because they're presenting something that doesn't work. So as we enter these meetings, we have some rules to make them work. And this is called the Braintrust. The Braintrust was originally a group of 6 people. It no longer is a group of 6 people. That is, within Pixar or Disney Animation, you can't actually name who the Braintrust is. It's the way some meetings are run. And not every meeting is run this way, because it's different kinds of problems have different kinds of requirements. This is one where you're calling together experienced colleagues, in this case, filmmakers, who understand what it means to tell a story and what the issues are. They're the ones who are in the room. So that's one of the requirements. This isn't a looky-lee or looky-loo where people are coming to watch the process and watch how the sauce is made. This is just a meeting for the people who are helping solve the problem. The second thing is to remove the power structure from the room. That is, nobody in that room or the room itself has the authority to tell the director or the leaders what they have to do as a consequence of what comes out of this meeting. So that means that, our chief creative officer, or if I'm in the room, or Jim Morris is currently the president of Pixar Animation, if they're in the room, they don't tell the director what to do. And even though we say that, obviously there are people who've got a lot of personal power, they project power because of their experience. The people who actually project power strongly are told to shut the hell up for the first 10 to 15 minutes. And the reason is you don't want them to set the tone in the room. It's better to enter a discussion than it is to set the tone. So all this is to try to remove the fear from the room. It's to enable the team to listen. So they're not coming in under an existential threat. They're not coming into a meeting where at the end of the meeting, somebody's going to give them a go, no-go decision. Like we're trying to get rid of all that baggage. This is purely about solving the problems that they've got, and to keep clear focus on that. In general, this works very well. Now, sometimes it goes off the rails and it doesn't work well. And that's because somebody isn't saying what they really think. And there could be various reasons for that. They don't want to look stupid, or they don't want to embarrass somebody else, or they're judging themselves. So there are things that actually get in the way of the problem. Now that does happen, and then we have to correct for it, figure, okay, what went wrong? What were the dynamics? Why were people afraid to say what they thought? What got in the way? Usually, as I mentioned, it works, as evidenced by the quality of the films that come out. And every once in a while, magic happens. And by magic, I mean that ego has left the room, so that ideas come and go without people becoming attached to them. So if I throw out an idea to solve a problem and it doesn't actually help solve the problem, then the ideal state is, oh, it didn't solve the problem. I don't feel judged. I don't feel bad because my idea wasn't taken. Or if the idea is taken, I don't feel like, oh, wow, I just made a major contribution. If you start to think that, the ego is in the room and it slows things up. And usually I'd say like once per film, we'll be in these meetings where it goes into an egoless state. And it's actually pretty phenomenal.
And can you feel it? Is it like in the room, there's an actual like physical sensation where you can feel the ego dissipating from the room? Is something that you, like the hair on the back of your neck stands up or something like that?
Well, there is for me, but I've asked other people in the room, and the ones who are actually in the egoless thing, because I don't comment that often. I mean, I do engage in the conversation, but because I'm not the storyteller, then I'm actually responding as a participant who's got various ideas. But for the most part, I'm watching the dynamics. And I believe that's my job as a leader, was to watch the dynamics. So when I see them go into this state, I will feel like this thrill that goes through my body. It's like, holy cow, we're in this state. But when I talk to a lot of them afterwards, they're so focused, that is, they're so in the process that their egoless state is that they're not actually looking at that state of the room. They're looking at solving the problem. Now, that's anecdotal, so I don't know what most of them actually.
You've not hooked them up to fMRIs or anything like that to watch what their brains are like, what they're going through. That'd be an interesting thing for a researcher to do at some point. But
you know, they come out but they will come out and say, "No, that was awesome. That was great. We made major advances." And I've just seen it a number of times. You walk into something, and sometimes they'll pick away at a problem, even though the whole films have been presented. They'll focus on one thing. And then they'll spend a significant amount of time, they'll pick at something, and then all of a sudden something will break through. You can just sort of feel it in the room. It's like, oh, we've actually uncovered the problem and the solution, and the room will feel that. Like when that happens, you know, oh, okay, we've got it.
And it turns out the one thing they were picking at actually goes and reverberates through the entire arc of the movie in many cases, right?
Yeah, and each one has a different case, but one in fairly recent times was with Inside Out. So it's Pete Docter's film, and the film was good, and we were very close to the end, but it didn't quite resonate, and we couldn't figure out why. So you got all the best people experienced looking at it, couldn't quite figure it out. So we did something which we hadn't done before, because we kept Disney and Pixar quite separate from each other for a variety of reasons. We could come back to later if you want. But we thought, you know, why don't we show the film to the other Braintrust? Down at Disney, it's called the Story Trust. Because they've never seen it before. But these two groups of people like each other. They have a vested interest in each other's success. They're very experienced, and they know what it means to give good notes at a certain period of time. In this case, it's late in the game for the film. So it was shown down there, and there were two people in particular down at Disney who were picking at a problem and interacting with Pete Docter, who's the director. And in this discussion, they came up with a subtle but powerful problem, which was very difficult to see. But once Pete saw it, it was like this reverberation, like, holy cow, now I see it. And the result was a large number of small changes to the film. And those small changes emotionally took it to this really powerful point. And now, if you look at any project like this, you can say, well, that made or break the film. There's all this work that's done, they're prepped. The thing comes in with an outside voice, because they haven't seen it before, gives them a new perspective. Then with that insight, they come back and can make all these changes. So that's an example of one. And then there's some where it's, you know, it's a 4x4 to the head, and it's a restart on a film, depending upon the film. They're all different.
Okay, well, I want to pick on you. You said we can come back and talk about Disney. There are a few questions that have come in related to this. It feels like a good time to ask that question. So I'll call out the question that my colleague Alex Gonzalez has asked. He said, when Disney acquired Pixar, one of the stated goals was to infuse Walt Disney Animation Studios with Pixar's ways of working. What was one of the most powerful cultural elements that Pixar was able to bring to Disney, and why did it have the impact that it ended up having?
Well, okay, so one of the things to note was that several people at Disney felt that we should actually merge the two studios together, or that we should shut Disney down because they weren't making successful films. So John and I did not want to do that. We wanted to have them both be healthy. One thing that I wanted to do, I felt very strongly about this, was to actually keep them quite separate. So a rule is put in place, which is still true to this day, and that is neither studio can or does do any production work for each other. The rule is they can beg, borrow, and steal ideas from each other, but they don't have to. And the idea was that there's no existential threat. And in particular, I didn't want And in general, in a fast-moving industry, I think it's a bad idea to talk about best practices. Best practices like, okay, let's solidify on the right way of doing things. Nonsense. Things are changing too fast. From my point of view, it was actually better having different groups with different ideas and different approaches, and we were actually had a more creative mix by doing that. And by removing the existential threat, what we allowed was for people to call each other and talk. So there was a great deal of sharing of information about technology or tools or processes. But the reason they could call and talk to the other was they knew that if they did so, there weren't going to be negative consequences. Like, you know, if they called, and they didn't go through the channels, they just called a person on the other side if they had a problem or an issue. It was just, you know, a discussion. And they would end up doing things different ways, which is the good thing, but inspire each other. So it was keeping that rule in place over all those years was important. But there was another reason for that. Well, there were a few reasons for that. One of them was that if Disney was to be successful, they had to have their own Braintrust. But they had to succeed on their own. If they made a movie and Pixar had done a lot of the work on it, then actually that would be demoralizing, because you don't want them to feel like somebody actually bailed them out. They needed to actually solve the problem themselves. So their first film that they made after we arrived there was Bolt. Bolt was a very good movie. Disney at that time didn't have a strong name, so the film is under-recognized. In fact, on Bolt, I got a call 1 year after the movie came out from Steve Jobs. And he said, you know, I put in a DVD and I just watched Bolt for the first time. So that was really a good movie. Oh yeah, thanks, Steve. But Disney recognized it and take a while to earn their name back, which of course they did do. But they solved the problems themselves, and it was hard. The question coming in was, were the people there just trained poorly, or did they not have the talent? And my view was that they actually did have the talent. There's remarkably talented people there. So the issue was, how do we actually get them to trust each other and have a different way of working and developing in what they were doing? And it took 2 years for probably an average to really kick in, for everything to come together. And the thing to note about this is that when we first got there, I spent in 2 meetings, I spent about a total of 3 hours total explaining all the principles of how we should work as a studio. And everybody nodded their head in agreement. They wanted to be successful. They loved these ideas about the sharing and the cooperation and the way the structure would work. They loved it. Now, it still took 2 years for it to become ingrained in the culture. And this was starting from a point of where they all agreed it was the right thing to do. So earning the trust and developing those relationships just takes time. Given the good ideas, agreeing on the good ideas is insufficient.
Well, you've got a call out in the chat. Speaking of Bold, another underrated movie, thanks to Catmull's influence on Disney, is Big Hero 6, which is another favorite of my kids. So that is one that got called out in the chat. But this idea of building trust across the collective, one of the other questions that's come in here, which I think is an interesting one related to this, is you mentioned sometimes you might have a director, you might have someone who's just stuck and not making progress. And I imagine that's something that is trust eroding. But when you're in a situation like that, where you found that there's someone who isn't moving, or there's someone who is inhibiting trust building up, how much rope do you give them? At what point do you decide you need to make a change, and how do you handle it?
Well, okay, that's a really good question. And I left it out of that first part. Is you're starting on something which is new, and it's a big and a difficult idea. And which means almost by definition that the first versions of it don't work. So how do you judge a project and the leaders when the project isn't working? All right, that's the fundamental question. And the answer for us is that you can't judge the project by what you see. You have to judge the team itself and how well they're working together. So if they've got the spirit, even though it's tough, like they're engaged, they're working on it, but they've also got laughter and things that are happening as they're wrestling with these problems, then they have all that rope. The one thing that the leader can't do is lose the crew. So we don't judge the project by whether or not the project's working. We judge it by whether or not the crew is still engaged with it. And the only time we've had to make the big serious changes was when the crew, a significant portion of the crew, said this isn't working. The leaders are not listening, or there are various things of that sort. But losing the crew is the one no-no, and that's our definition. We do not, we take care to make sure we're not judging it by the project itself. If the project isn't working and the people inside feel like they're stuck because of the leadership, they will say so. But if the leadership is adapting and they're listening and everybody's engaged, and even though the thing is going all over the place, still not working, you say, well, that's part of the process. That's what they do. And it works very well, but I won't say it's smooth or it's painless, because sometimes a director does lose the crew.
And the process of creating anything is never a smooth and painless process. So Linda Hill from the Harvard Business School, who co-authored Collective Genius with one of I think the former CTO of Pixar, one of her phrases is creative abrasion. And you need that. You need to have that kind of tension that comes to create the sparks that ultimately lead to interesting things. So if it was simple and easy, everybody would have already done it already. And it is the pain, the struggle that sometimes is necessary in order to succeed. I guess related to that,
enough about the creative abrasion. What I found was really interesting is there are some people that this even starting back at Toy Story, they'll get up there and they have these intense conversations where they're turning red in the face, and if you didn't know them, you would interpret this as this argument. But and there are a number of these afterwards, in which they're coming out in their red face and their voices are raised, and the people, like Andrew Stanton and Brad Bird and so forth, said, "Man, that was a great meeting. I love that. I love it that they're so passionate about it." So from the outside, it looks abrasive in a negative sense. Internally, it's intense, but it's not abrasive in a personal sense. It's it's intensity because of a passion of trying to solve a problem. That's the ideal state.
Great. And that connects into a question that I've seen from a couple of different angles from people. I see Steve Bussey and Christian Layden both have asked a version of this, which is, Steve has said, what type of individual do you need to really harness this kind of creative tension? What mindset, skills, personality, et cetera? And then the parallel question to that from Christian is this something that can be taught? Or are these skills and mindsets that essentially people either have them or don't have them? What's your point of view on that?
Well, with the answer is, like at Disney, that after going through this process, that story trust turned into this incredibly productive and amazing storytelling group. And they were largely the same people as when they were making films that weren't that good. So but that didn't mean that every person made the transition. Not everybody did. So I'd say some people didn't learn it, but by enabling and making it safe and creating the safe environment, that most of the people actually became extraordinarily good. So by creating and supporting a safe environment, the answer was they did do it. So was it taught or was it enabled? It's somewhat of both. If you are newer to a field or newer to a company and you come in and you participate in the meetings and you see how it works, then what it does, it gives you the confidence to speak. All right, well, that's something that as managers we can work on. How do we make the safe environment? And my experience is that, and I'm going to say this roughly, not that we have a way of counting, but 90% of the people given the chance to do better will do better. There's a really high success rate of giving people the chance and trusting in them. And in way too many places, there's the focus on the downside of the 10%. Like if somebody doesn't work, it's a disaster, and so they become very conservative. It's a lost opportunity, and it's a real difficult problem. So let me try to describe this 90% rule. I have two rules. One's a 90% rule, and the other is a 70% rule. The 90% rule came about because when we make our films, we've got multiple films going on at the same time, but they're at different stages. But the associate producers and the leaders get together to try to get the best people to work on their film. So it's a casting meeting. And they'll get together, they'll have these intense and frequently not very pleasant meetings. Probably one of the most unpleasant parts of the project is arguing over who they get to work on a project, which I found a very frustrating process. So I met with the leaders once and I asked the question of the group. I said, in all the years that we've been doing this, you usually can't get everybody that you want. So that means that you have to take a chance on people who have not done the job before. You are asking them to rise to the occasion, and you're doing this because you have to, because you can't get who you want. So in all the times you've asked somebody to rise to the occasion, what percentage of the time were they not able to rise to the occasion? And one of the senior leaders there said 10% of the time, and the others nodded their heads. I asked the same question down at Disney later and got the same thing. Now, this blew my mind. They've been having these arguments and they've only had a 10% rate of people that didn't rise to the occasion. And these are people who pride themselves in taking risks, and they were not willing to take risks on people. So I had to process this one. And as I went back and thought about it, I realized that from their point of view, when we make our films, that in front of them, they have unknown problems coming at an unknown time of unknown size. That's their risk. And in order to address that risk, they want to make sure that everybody knows how to deal with the problem. And therefore, they don't want to take any gamble on the people. Okay, now here's the interesting part, though, is that if you go back and explain the logic to them, that with a 90% success rate of people rising to the occasion, that the 10% is truly in the noise level compared to the other problems they have. So they really aren't taking risks when they're doing that. They're benefiting in the short term and in the long term. So the logic says they shouldn't be having the arguments, they should be just taking the gamble on the people. So even though logically they understand it, they still couldn't do it. The imperative to deliver is so powerful that it overrode the logic from their own experience. Well, that's pretty powerful stuff. So we had to make structural changes in order to have it so that the casting process didn't go through those same people, because they weren't making the right choices, and they couldn't. But these are other than this particular blanket, these are phenomenal, experienced leaders. Now, in some respects, it's both bizarre, but the other side is fascinating. But it also reveals that, well, if you really do trust in people and you give them the chance and you create an environment, then most of them are actually going to make major contributions to your company. That's what you want.
It's a big theme that I'm hearing in this discussion, this idea of trust, making sure that you've got the right environment, making sure that you can have a space where people can have these vibrant discussions and disagreements and have the abrasion without being abrasive. And it is something that probably more people inside the organizations of the people who are on this webinar can do than people realize. So Ed, we could talk about this, I'm sure, for hours and hours, but just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to just give you one last question, which really has nothing to do with Eat, Sleep, Innovate or the things we talked about before. But you mentioned Steve Jobs, and I can't help but ask, in Creativity Incorporated, the afterword is all about the relationship you have with Steve. And of course, you worked incredibly closely with him. What's the biggest thing in your view that the world gets wrong about Steve?
Well, and this is a very important one because I knew Steve when his behavior was not very good. He was younger, and it's from a storytelling point of view, like for press or writing or making movies, the sort of behavior is more exciting. It's more dramatic to watch it. Because Steve was like that early on, what people didn't fully understand is that Steve went through the classic hero's journey. So he starts in his company, which is Apple. He gets kicked out. So it's like he's kicked out of his kingdom and he wanders around in the wilderness and he makes a bunch of mistakes. So the first version of Pixar failed. We had to restart it. Next didn't succeed as a company. He created something which is important to him, just like with Pixar. A value was created, but the realization wasn't as was originally anticipated. But in this journey through the wilderness, Steve learned a lot, and he became a very empathetic person. His way of dealing with people changed. And here was the key thing: is after Steve went through these changes, which is around in the early 90s, that after he changed, the people who were with him stayed with him for the rest of his life. Or that's how powerful the change was. And so when Steve went back to Apple, it was not the same Steve at all as the one who had left. So Apple then became this incredibly gigantic and successful and momentous company. The problem is that when things were written about Steve, all the people who were with Steve weren't going to talk about him because Steve was still alive. He had cancer, we knew that, but the actual transformation in Steve was not part of the public story. And therefore the outside sees things written about Steve or movies or TV programs and say, well, okay, well, this is this kind of person who made that Apple. That's not what happened. It was the Steve who went through the journey and the failures and the learning and the getting the empathy and gaining all that experience. That was the person that made the new Apple. It was that person, was that journey that should be emulated and that learning. And that's the misconception, is people are tying the original behavior to the success of Apple and not the changed behavior that led to the new Apple.
Excellent. Well, Ed, I'm going to indulge and see if I can get one more quick one in. Ryan Till has said, you talked about the 90% rule and you mentioned 70% as well. What's the 70% rule? Ryan wonders. Is that something that can be answered quickly?
Oh, yes, very important. This one I discovered early on. When I did not want to be a manager, I was a researcher. This is back at New York Tech after I got my doctorate degree. And I had these theories about how to manage a group of researchers. And as I got into it, I realized that about 2/3 of the things that I tried to do were right, and 1/3 of them were a complete crock. So they just were wrong. So, 30% of what I thought was wrong. And when I left to go to Lucasfilm, I said, I'll bet the same thing happens again, is that I'm going to learn from everything I've done. I'll, keep the things I did right. I'll do some new things, but 1/3 of them will probably be mistakes. And that's actually what happened. And I know people like about 80-20 rules or 90-10 rules, but I believe that it is very good for leaders just to say to themselves, I'm experienced, I'm here for a reason, but 1/3 of what I'm thinking or what I believe is a complete crock. I'm just wrong 1/3 of the time. I'm not right most of the time. I'm wrong 1/3 of the time. And I believe what it does, and what it did for me was to walk into meetings and saying, okay, I might be wrong, so I have to listen. And that's why I think it's an important rule. It's the rule that says, okay, there's a good chance I'm just wrong, and approach everything that way.
Well, Ryan Till, thank you very much for asking the question, because I think that's great last words of advice from Ed Catmull. Think that you're wrong 1/3 of the time, and listen, and listen. So Ed, I have listened very intently to this discussion. Again, to the people who are listening, I would highly recommend Creativity Inc. If you haven't read it, you should absolutely read the whole book. Pay very careful attention to the 33 principles at the end of the book, but read everything before that as well. Thanks so much for joining us, Ed. This has been great.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, take care, everybody. Be well.
Thanks. Bye-bye.